Well, we are delighted to have back in on this first day of 2013. John Mittendorf's in the studio with us, and we're going to be talking about ancient technology. We have discussed this before, John, but I'm looking forward to getting into it again. By the way, we're going to be giving away this book. Tell me about it.
You know, Perry, I was going over my notes a couple weeks ago, and I noticed the last time we really covered this subject was in 2007, believe it or not.
Really?
Five years ago.
Wow.
Which was just radio at that time.
Right.
And by the way, Happy New Year
Happy
to
New
you
Year.
and to the Dove listeners
Thank
and
you.
watchers.
Yeah.
But now we have radio and television, and I thought, you know, back when we did this originally, we didn't have the luxury of putting graphics on the television.
Mm-hmm.
Now we do, which we're going to use a little bit this morning as an introduction to the program. But there's also been a lot of changes in ancient technology since '07, and you're seeing a lot more information come out. You might not believe it, but you can't ignore it.
Yeah.
Which is a common phrase that's used today, and that's where the term OPARTs, O-O-P-A-R-T-S, comes from, out-of-place artifacts. They shouldn't be there, but they're there.
Okay.
And so this book, which is just produced by Master Books, Answers in Genesis, just came out a couple of months ago. It's a great book that overviews what we're going to be talking about. And I love the title. It says, The Genius of Ancient Man, Evolution's Nightmare. But I could also change the title to The Genius of Ancient Man, Evolution's and Archaeology's Nightmare.
Okay.
Because it's both of them.
All right, we're going to be giving this book away coming up in about 20 minutes or so, so be listening, and you could win it. Well, as I was talking about the program earlier with Jerry, I asked Jerry the question.
Right.
Did the early man have electricity? Did they fly?
Right.
And how did they move those big stones?
And how do they move the big stones?
When they were made over here and the pyramids over there.
That's exactly right.
And of course, he goes back to the Ben-Hur movie when they got
a bazillion guys pulling this stone up this ramp, right? And putting it into place.
Right.
Yeah.
And using trees where they're nowhere to be found as rollers.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So I asked the question, is it possible that they discovered reverse gravity?
Right.
Anyway, so where are we going, pal?
Well, you discovered the whole thing right there. So.
Yeah.
What I want to do is I want to use this morning, Perry, just to provide a foundation, because I think there's a lot of people that are listening and watching this morning that didn't really hear us 5 years ago. Lucky for them, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So if we just jump into the technical side of this, they'd probably say, what on earth are you talking about? But if we take it kind of a building block approach and kind of start off and do a little bit of foundational work this morning, I think then when we cover this next month and get into the specifics of the interior of the pyramid, it becomes a lot more plain on what we're talking about. And as I just said, there's a lot of information available today. This book is one. This is one of my favorites, which is the History Channel, which I do not recommend people buy unless you want to be schmoozed by modern science.
Ancient aliens?
Ancient aliens, yeah. And this type of information, this DVD, this book, here's another one I just picked up off the stands. This is also brand new. This is from Time magazine, Man-Made Wonders. And usually when anybody talks about archaeology, the picture that is most commonly used is the pyramids.
The pyramids, yeah.
The pyramids.
Yeah.
It's the only artifact left out of the original 7 wonders of the world that's still there. It's also 500 feet high. That's roughly a 50-story building. And everybody is familiar with a pyramid, but everybody usually says, I always wondered how they did that. Mm-hmm. Because when you watch the History Channel, what they tell you as far as how they perceive the pyramid was built doesn't really ring true. But I think the focus on all this, Perry, is not so much the scientific perspective and what the ancient Egyptians and ancient man was capable of doing, but how it dovetails with the Bible.
Okay.
And that's the most important part.
Let me say to our viewers and listeners again, we're going to be giving away The Genius of Ancient Man, Evolution's Nightmare. The picture of this big book here, it's like a big coffee table book, absolutely beautifully illustrated as well. Coming up a little bit later on as we talk about this. And don't forget that as we discuss these things, these programs will be at the Dove website on YouTube, and you can send them to your family and friends. All right, so everybody knows that the pyramids are there, and they go, how did that happen, and how do they make them so precise?
Right. Let me back up just for a minute and talk about the biblical perspective on this, because this is going to carry through this series that we're going to do. Archaeology and modern science has painted themselves into a very difficult closet or a corner. In that, modern science says that over thousands and thousands, maybe a million years, man has evolved basically from the goo to the zoo to you, which, you know, it's a common phrase. So that means that basically from the beginning of time, you know, the molecules got together, and then finally everything evolved to what we see today. But man goes back approximately a million years and has evolved from then to what we see now. The problem with that is that man has graduated through the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Caveman, the Neanderthal, and all that stuff.
And we really haven't changed.
Well, in some cases, no. In some cases,
we lost hair.
Yeah, we've gone backwards. That this is where people have a real problem. They say, well, now, wait a minute, John, that if I go back 4, 5, 6, 7,000 years and man supposedly was living in caves at that time, how come I see all of this technology that's around the world today, and particularly now that the History Channel, and by the way, this really is a good DVD if you don't accept the fact that ancient aliens brought all this technology here and then left, right? That the only way that modern science can explain the technology that we see that was developed in the past that in some cases exceeds our technology today. We can't figure out how they did it. The only way they can explain that is to say, well, ancient man wasn't smart enough to do that because he's evolved over thousands of years. Therefore, he didn't have the intelligence, the brilliance to do that. So how do you explain that then? Because you cannot get away from the picture on the front of this time booklet, the pyramids. I mean, there they are. Stonehenge is another example. And so the only way they can explain that is they say, well, okay, ancient aliens brought it here and dropped it off, and then they left again. Do you buy that?
Little flyby.
Yeah, because there is absolutely no evidence that there's anybody else in this universe except us. None. Zero. Okay? Now, how do you explain technology from the past from a biblical perspective? Piece of cake. Piece of cake. You heard it here first on theDove, right?
Yeah, right.
That if God created Adam and Eve in His image, He created them smart. He created them with intelligence. In fact, I don't think it's too far out of the mainstream to believe that Adam and Eve were created perfect. If they were created in the likeness of God, they were created brilliant people.
All right. Now, is it true, most research will say even in today and all of its modern technology, we're still only using about 10 to 15% of our brains?
That is correct. However, when Adam and Eve were created brilliant,
they were using all of it, huh?
Well, I would assume so. I mean,
we
don't know.
We don't know, but
that's speculation.
Why would God waste 85% of something He created?
He also charged Adam and Eve with the ability to manage the earth for their use, for their well-being. That's right out of Genesis.
Dominion.
And so, using that perspective, then Adam and Eve sinned. Once they sinned, Adam and Eve, the earth and the universe were cursed. It's been a downhill slide ever since then. But if we go back to when Adam and Eve were created, and they were created brilliant, if you look at biblical chronology, if you go about 1,650 years, that's when the flood happened. The flood happened about 1,600 years after Adam and Eve were created. During that time frame, this is also right out of Genesis, everybody spoke the same language, and the average age for a person was 912 years.
Wow.
Methuselah was 950, 60, 70 years, something like that, just shy of 1,000 years. So I don't think it's difficult to, if you look at that, to believe that if over a period of over 1,600 years, everybody spoke the same language, and man originally started intelligent, what that intelligence would have grown to over 1,600 years with everybody speaking the same language and living long lives. A classic example would be, what would Einstein been capable of doing if he would have lived 912 years?
Well, there you go.
See?
Yeah.
So, and I think we tend to forget that, and that's right.
Well, look at today's modern technology. Where is the digital age going to end up?
Exactly right, and it's not linear. The digital age and our intelligence is basically exploding. You know, where were we 50 years ago, 60 years ago? I can remember when my dad bought the first television in 1948, it was this black and white tube thing, you know. And so we've changed a little bit since then. And the fact is, you had the flood, okay, a lot of things were destroyed, but then about 100 years, 120 years after the flood, you had Babel. And as you know, they were building a tower into heaven, and then God dispersed the people and changed the languages. Now, next month when we get into a little bit more of this, you're going to see how this all dovetails perfectly. In that, if everybody had the same technology at Babel and then were split because of the languages, shouldn't you see the same level of technology that was common to them at that time
in other places
all over the world? And the answer is yes, and you do.
Yeah.
And you do. As an example, do you see pyramids in America? I'm talking about the United States of America. The answer is yes. Monk's Mound, which is in Mississippi, is the same size as Khufu in Egypt. Has the same 13-acre base to it. It's not as high because over the years it was made out of mud and brick. You know, it's weathered down, but it's basically the same size. If you go to Etowah Grounds in Georgia, there's 13 pyramids inside of a compound. If you go down to the Yucatan Peninsula, the Mayans, all their pyramids, Temple of the Jaguar, and so on. It's all of the same stuff all over the world. So when you look at it from a biblical perspective, it's easy to understand why you see the same thing in the Yucatan Peninsula, in North Africa, Egypt, and even the United States.
There you go.
Now, how do you answer that? You answer that from a biblical perspective. Modern science can answer that.
Yeah. So obviously they had, they were smarter than us. Is that fair to say? Or they utilize more of their brain than we do?
I would say they utilize more of their brain, and I would say in some specific areas that we're going to be talking about, they were smarter than us because they were doing things that we cannot or we don't do today, and we can't figure out how they did it. To me, if we were as smart as the Egyptians, let's say, today we're only capable of lifting somewhere between 1,000 to 1,300 ton weight. If you go to Bonneville Dam as an example, how they lift the generators out, they have these immense cranes that lift them out. They're about 1,000 tons. Okay. The Egyptians could lift 20,000 tons, 20 times more than we can lift today. And yet there's no machinery left over into how they did that. And we can't figure out how they did it. Although next month we're going to answer how they did that.
Okay, because when you go to the pyramids, and I know our own Steve Johnson was really taken by your first time we went down this road.
Yeah, he's been inside the pyramid.
How big those stones are.
Yep.
How perfectly they are cut. So what did, how did they cut them?
Yes.
How did they move them?
Right. How did they put them into place?
And how did they engineer that?
Right. In fact, we'll talk about that
So
next
is there
month.
another purpose to the pyramid than just a point in the sky?
It would appear so. In fact, if
and by the way, there's nobody, the treasures aren't buried in those, are they?
No, you know, that's an interesting concept, Perry.
Everybody thinks the king's in there and all their goodies are in there.
It's interesting in that the common answer is to why did they build the pyramids? People will say, well, they built them as a tomb to the pharaohs. The problem with that is, according to Egyptologist Dr. Mark Lanier, who's a renowned Egyptologist, he says they have never found a pharaoh in any pyramid. None. Zero. And there's 80 pyramids in Egypt. They find all the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun's a classic example. Ramses III is another example. They're all in the Valley of the Kings. And some people say, well, the old kingdom of Egypt, they might have put them in the pyramids. Yes, if that's possible, then why don't you find artifacts in the pyramids? In fact, if somebody was to come in and rob a pyramid and to take, let's say, the gold and the silver and all the things out of the pyramid, would they clean everything out so the inside was spick and span? No, they would just take the things that were worth money and then leave the junk behind, right? There's nothing inside the pyramids to indicate that. So, but there's everything to indicate that in the Valley of the Kings. So then the question arises, why did they build the ancient pyramid? And the only pyramid the people have been inside of is Khufu, which is the Grand Pyramid. It's about 500 feet high. And that's because about 800 AD, they think it was a tomb robber bored inside the pyramid and happened to bore into one of the channels, which opened up the entire inside of the pyramid. In fact, if I can have the technological guys put the graphic on the screen of the pyramid, there it is right there. I want you to notice as you look at that, Perry, that the pyramid in the background has, which looks like a cap on it.
Right.
And the reason why that looks that way is because when the pyramids were built, they were built out of limestone, which is the cheap stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then they put capstones on the outside, which were a harder stone.
For the weather.
But for the weather. But it was also polished white limestone, which was a harder limestone.
Mm.
And they feel that the top of the pyramid, which you can see in the picture there, is the only part of the pyramid that's left that has the original capstones on it. And everything below that has a very rough appearance because they feel there was a large earthquake back in time that a lot of the capstones came off, and then also the Ottomans and the Greeks and the Romans stripped them off and used them for their own construction projects. Mm. So the pyramids, although they still look grand, they have that cobby look to them. That's because they've been stripped of their outer core. They also feel that because they were a polished white, that when the sun rose and set, that the pyramids would be this orange or reddish color, capped with a gold top on it.
Wow. And
that's why they called it one of the 7 wonders of the world, which is the only one left.
Is there any evidence of these things being robbed and the material showing up somewhere else?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
Yeah.
Basically, nobody even looks in the pyramids now for artifacts. They're all looking in the Valley of the Kings, and that's why Tutankhamun. They thought that they had found everything there was to find, and all of a sudden this guy found Tutankhamun's tomb, which had never been robbed, and of course it was just immense.
How far from where the blocks were made in the pyramid, what's the distance?
Well, the limestone blocks were fairly close. However, next month when we get into the interior of the Grand Pyramid, there's pink granite inside for a specific reason. And that granite came from Aswan, which is 500 miles away, and it's up to 40 tons per block.
How'd they move it? How'd they do that?
We'll talk a little bit about that next month, see? And you're going to have to step outside the box for that one.
Now, you and I have talked before the possibility of that they discovered how to reverse gravity.
Yeah.
Is that theory gaining any traction?
No, because, well, let's put it this way, Perry. It has traction because of the Coral Castle in Homestead, Florida.
That guy apparently figured it out.
Yeah, and that was a Latvian immigrant that came over here from Latvia, and he always boasted, I know how the Egyptians did it. And it's well documented that he built a castle, which is now a visitor center. He died in the 50s. He died, and his estate left it to the state to turn into a visitor center, which they have. And you can go there now, and you can look at it. It's a huge castle, and there's pink granite on the grounds up to 35 tons per block. It's well documented that he had flatbed trucks deliver the blocks at night. The driver would come back in the morning, the truck would be empty, and there was no machinery on the premises. And he always boasted, I know how the Egyptians did it. The only artifacts that are left in his workshop are artifacts that have to do with electricity and magnetism, which are 33 times together stronger than gravity. What also gives that credibility is when you watch the History Channel, they will tell you that the pyramids were built by the Egyptians dragging these blocks up a ramp. Mm-hmm. They know about how long it took the Egyptians to build Khufu, which is somewhere between 10 to 20 years. If you accept the 10-year bracket, they would have had to place a block every 45 seconds to place 2.3 million blocks into position for the pyramid.
Why?
So they couldn't have dragged them up and put them into place.
Okay.
They couldn't have.
What's the purpose of the pyramid?
The purpose of the pyramid, this is purely speculation, but if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it probably is.
Yeah.
There's good evidence that the purpose of the Grand Pyramid, Khufu, was that it was used as a power factory.
Because otherwise, why did they build them the way they did?
Why did they build them the way that they did? In fact, if I can have the tech guys bring up the drawing of the interior of the pyramid, which would probably be drawing number 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And they're probably looking, there you go right there. There is a diagram, and now we've got people listening on the radio that don't have the ability to look at the diagram, but there is a diagram of the pyramid that, as you can see, there's a device in the middle of the pyramid that's vertical, and there's passageways that come off of that to go to the exterior of the pyramid. Down below this device that's in the middle of the pyramid is, which is the device in the middle of the pyramid is called the king's chamber. Down below that is called the queen's chamber, and then there's a huge channel inside. As I said, Steve has walked inside of that.
Yeah.
If you believe that the pyramid was built as a funerary device, you'll be hard to explain what all those passageways and what all those devices inside the pyramid are. They're made out of specific tolerances and specific stone. We'll talk about that next month.
Well, this is fascinating, and again, I want to say to our viewers and listeners, you can share this via YouTube. We'll be on the Dove website in a couple of days, and you can send it around. We do have this book called The Genesis of...
The Genius of Ancient Man.
Genius.
Yeah.
Genius of Ancient Man, Evolution's Nightmare.
Evolution's and Archaeology's Nightmare.
All right. This is going to caller number 8 at 776-5368, 776-5368. All right, we got a minute, so what are we going to talk about next time?
Next time I want to talk about the pyramid specifically, and we already said, okay, what was it built for? And I said if it walks and looks like a duck, it probably is. That how does scientific investigation tend to look at the pyramid as a power factory, believe it or not, that produced some type of electromechanical energy back 2,500 years before Christ.
All right, we'll see you next time, John.
Yes, sir.
Okay.